Christopher Lynn, welcome to the Warrior Podcast. Thanks for being on, man.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I like these long form ones.
Yeah, me too, man. I definitely appreciate you being on. So, what's been going on in your world lately? You live in the Milwaukee area of Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, I do. And so most recently, I think the biggest thing is I've got a whole bunch of kids, so winters are long.
Because you're all
Cuz
stuck inside all the time.
yeah, we're all stuck inside and there's really nothing you can do.
Yeah,
And so
especially up where
last
you
week was a
live.
little I know, that's the
Yeah.
thing. And so last week was a little bit of a teaser because it was in the 80s.
Hmm.
And so it was, amazing. And then it snowed over the weekend.
Oh gosh,
And
it's
then
crazy.
it's been a little chilly. So that's the most recent thing. You get excited about it and then it's taken away, but at least spring is here. So
Right.
it's much better on this end than in the fall when you're like, "Oh no, we're we're going into it."
Yeah, I bet, man. Yeah, it's been. I live in North Carolina. It's been kind of warm here, but they're saying it's supposed to cool off here starting really late weekend into next week. Not as cold
Okay.
as what it is there, but definitely cool for North Carolina for this time of year. So,
Yeah.
well, Christopher, you're the author of the book "Relentless Intention: The Power of Purpose." And get that off my tongue. You're also a corporate exec with your primary focus being on employee development. If you will,
Yeah.
real quick before we really get into the nuts and bolts of everything, talk a little bit about what your day to day looks like for you. Like, kind of what do you do from day to day?
Yeah, so I got into this. So in short, I was always an educator, right?
Hmm.
I was originally a teacher and all this, and I was always fascinated. And I would say as I've walked on my journey as a believer, I've started to unpack more why that matters
Right,
to me so much. But I was always fascinated with bringing the best out in people and
right,
seeing what was inside of them and helping them, just, bring that to light. And so that led to my, professional journey. And so a day for me, I work for a healthcare company that primarily serves underserved populations
mm,
in across the US. And so that's really where my focus is. But my responsibility is to take care of our employees and how are we actually making sure they have the skills they need and that we're accommodating for what they need to do for our patients is really that. And so my day, I run that for the enterprise. So I've got a fairly large team, about 30 people, and then I've got about 60 who are indirect up to me. So a lot of it is really staying ahead 6, 12, sometimes 38 months, thinking forward to what do people need before they need it so that we can plan our organizational strategy around that. Because at the end of the day, our product is people. So I'm in a ton of meetings talking with all of my counterparts. My kids usually just kind of sit out there because they're like, Daddy's in meetings a lot. So that's my day life. But because I work from home, I'm in kind of a unique situation in that I work 100% remote, which I absolutely love because I get to be a dad at the same time I get to do what I love professionally. And yeah, so between that, meetings and all that, and then it's time with the family.
that's awesome. Um, and we're gonna talk a lot today. We're gonna spend a great deal of time today talking about technology because I know that's something that you really uh, enjoy, something that you really love, it's something that you
Yeah.
use probably a lot in your life. And we're going to kind of talk about, how to navigate its use in our world today, especially as a parent. So we're going to, really get into talking about, stuff like that. But before we get into all that, walk us through your story, starting as far back as you can remember, and just really share with us what life was like growing up for you.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't get to talk about this all that often. It's in the book. Some of it is.
Right.
Because I think on the surface, especially if people know me professionally, if you follow me on LinkedIn or things like that, you kind of see this public persona. I would say by some definition, some would consider it success by some American standard. And that's not how I grew up. I came from a really broken home. My mom she was traumatized by growing up in a family in the occult.
Mm,
She suffered massively as a result of that. Anybody who's familiar with trauma knows that trauma usually carries generation to generation. So for me, I grew up right around that, and it was pretty traumatic. And I had a sister who was severely disabled, and so my childhood was was rough, to say the
Sounds
least.
like it. Did you grow up in Milwaukee, or did you grow up somewhere else?
No, I was raised originally in Colorado,
Okay.
and then we moved out to Minnesota. And interestingly, my dad and now my stepmom are both funeral directors. And so that was kind of another unique twist, was there was
Yeah, I
kind of
bet.
this crazy trauma, and then being in the death industry is bizarre sometimes, to say the
Right.
least. I'm thankful for it. Looking back, in the moment, I feel like that's how God usually works. In the
Right.
moment, you're never like, this is amazing. Reflecting back, I go, I wouldn't change a thing about it, but it wasn't always that way.
So, you say your mom's side of the family was it was in the occult. Give us an overview of what that looked like or consisted of. Like, what are some of the things that you saw back during that time?
You know what's funny about it is, I think for a lot of people, they have this idea of what the occult is, and it's this sinister, thing that you think will be really obvious and apparent to everybody. You'd be able to point them out in a crowd and go, "Oh, I bet that's that." And that was actually quite the opposite. On the surface, you would have never known
Mm,
any of this. I mean, they were active in a church, pillars
really?
of the community, business owners. I mean, all this stuff. So on the surface, everything looked normal. And even as a kid growing up, I actually never really understood it. My mother suffered from multiple personality disorder. And I mean, there was just crazy stuff that as a kid, you have no categories for it. So you're like, what is wrong with my mom? But we were always didn't have much of a relationship with that family. And I didn't really know why. And then the few encounters we had, something just was always off, but you couldn't quite tell what it was. And so on the surface, and it wasn't until I got older where I really found out what was going on. But I do remember a time when I probably would have been elementary school age, where I had to go into hiding. And I
Mm,
didn't really understand why, and nobody really explained it to me. But basically, I was told, like, you cannot go anywhere without us. You cannot be outside. And we kind of had to go into hiding. And I later found out there were concerns that her family was going to try and take me, and who knows what. I didn't really get into it, but it was one of these, like, the time I had no category for it. And now looking back, all these pieces that were very confusing and traumatic and all this stuff, you kind of go, that's what was going on with all of this.
mm. Well, how would you describe your relationship with your dad? During this time, he wasn't he wasn't a part of this of the occult aspect of things,
No.
right?
It's funny. I have a lot of respect for him in some ways. And in some ways, I'm like, well, that's a characteristic I wouldn't want to carry. And one thing that's a plus and a minus for him is he's a blind optimist. And so I think in some ways, he was young in his career, trying to figure out life, trying to figure out what to do. And he was so busy with that that I don't really think he even knew what was going on.
Hmm.
He didn't really see it. He was too distracted with these other things. And so as a kid, I felt really alone in this. I didn't really have much of a relationship. And that's not to say I didn't, if you were to talk to my dad, and I can think of times, we did things together occasionally. It's not like he was never there, but it was almost like he was there, but he wasn't. And I think anybody can relate to that kind of situation where you have somebody in your life, they're present, they're not really present. And so now, as we've gotten older, um, that's changed. And I would say, probably even in the more recent years, that's changed. And we've grown closer and gotten to know each other on a deeper level. But he's a complicated guy sometimes.
So I believe you mentioned that your parents split up. Is that right?
That's correct.
How
Yeah.
old were you when that happened?
I think I was 12,
12.
um, which was which was challenging because the way they originally split up, my mom went into a psych ward after another suicide attempt, um, and then she just never came home.
Hmm.
And so that was, very bizarre for me. And then my sister, who had Down syndrome, autism, I mean, she was very disabled, kind of became my responsibility. Cause again, my dad's trying to
Mm.
figure out life and take care of me. He's got a wife who's, just kind of off the chain, and he doesn't really have categories for it. And so I kind of became, and then I had a brother who's 10 years younger than me. So he was very young. And then my sister's 5 years younger than me. And so I kind of ended up having to figure out how to take care of
You had to grow
myself
up.
and my family. I had to grow up really
Yeah, really
quick.
quick. And
Yeah,
you said
very
you were
quick.
12 years old when this happened? Yeah,
Hmm.
that's a lot of pressure for anybody, much less a 12-year-old.
Yeah, and like I said, looking at the time, it's just awful. You just don't know how you're even getting through the end of the day. But looking back, I wouldn't change it. So I guess that's how God's managed to work through
Right,
those experiences.
exactly. Did so your mom and dad split up when you were around 12. Your dad ended up getting remarried, right? I think you said you
Yeah,
had a stepmom.
relatively shortly after. Yeah, so my mom and dad were split. She lived in a different town, and we would occasionally see her. I mean, again, when she would be in a decent mental state, I mean, I don't have horrible memories of her. I mean, I just there was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There was the side, and then literally when it would turn,
Mm,
it was terrifying. And so when she was in the right state of mind, like we still saw her occasionally. And then again, she kind of fell off the face of the earth. And I can talk about more about that if you ever want. But I've had some reconnection with her and then haven't. But about maybe a year and a half after they officially split, my dad got remarried.
and, so how did your life change at that point?
Um,
I think you mentioned to me when we talked
in
one time that she was a Christian, right? Your
She
stepmom?
was. Yeah, she is. She is.
Oh, yeah,
And
she
in
is.
many ways, that was extremely helpful because she came into our life. And one thing that, again, it can be a really great thing, it can be a really not great thing. She saw the dysfunction and said, this has to stop. Your 12-year-old son and me are not going to raise your handicapped daughter. And like, this is not healthy. We need to get help. We need to, do all this other stuff. So she kind of came in and said, this isn't working. Your kids are, you know, kind of running amok. You've got all this stuff. So she kind of came in and said, we need to put some order in place. And
Mm,
like I said, that can be good. That can also be really hard. But she also was a
exactly.
Christian,
Mhm.
and we went to church, but I don't know that it really was, it was a small town local church. You just kind of went. It was more of a social club than I
Yeah.
would say anything where really the gospel was preached. And so she's like, no, we're going to find a gospel preaching church. We're going to get involved in that. And it happened to be 40 miles away, which felt like, are you kidding? We have to drive 40 minutes to church. Why? And so she really had a very positive influence on our family.
Awesome. Take us to your middle school and high school years, and then even on into college after that. How would you describe that time of your life?
Uh, I in the middle school, so we had moved into the area, and then I transitioned kind of in late elementary and then into middle school. So it was a very confusing time around that because that's when the whole like my mom left and nobody really knew, and the whole stigma, especially in a small town, you couldn't really talk about like what was going on with my mom. It was just like she's not well. So you also couldn't talk about this. So it was a very confusing time, and I didn't really know even how to interact with other people because yeah, I struggled socially. I was trying to figure out who I was and all this. So middle school was a
Exactly.
tough time. I had a few
Yeah, I bet.
close friends, and that really helped. I had some close friends that I stuck close to who were there for me, and I tried to navigate as best I could. And it stayed the same in high school. I think one thing that maybe made it easier and harder was because I had grown up being forced to be extremely durable and resilient. I didn't deal with a lot of the stuff that a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers do. Like I didn't care whether I was popular or not. I didn't care about those kinds of things. It wasn't important to me to, this and that. And so some of the typical high school, middle school drama didn't really affect me. But as a result, I was pretty isolated. I kind of navigated my own way. I had my inner crew and just kind of stuck to it. But my dad and mom were very public in this community too. So I also had to live up to some sort of perfect standard of like everything's great all the time. So that was
Right.
tough. That was very tough.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. You ended up going to college, Northwestern. Is that right?
Yeah,
Was that? I
Northwestern
think.
Bible College in Minnesota.
Okay. Um, and that was for your undergrad degree. What was your degree in?
So I originally went in. So this again, I see how these pieces all come together now. Didn't see it at the time. I
Exactly.
had, because we were involved in the church now. It was, you need to go to a Christian college because it'll be better for you than a state school where you're just gonna. And I think there was some wisdom from my parents being like, you had a really messed up childhood. Like there is a real opportunity for you to just go off the range without some sort of guidance. And so I was very technical. I loved computers. I was a coder and did all sorts of stuff. And so I'd looked into an engineering program, a software engineering program, looking into that. And so I was originally going to go into technical stuff and figure out, maybe a software engineer. People thought I was going to go start some tech company. But I quickly discovered I like technology, but it's boring to me. It's not challenging, it's very predictable. And I didn't really know what to do with that. And people naturally saw that I liked helping bring out things in other people. And so that's how I ended up going to school to be a teacher
Hmm.
because they didn't know what to do with me. They're like, you're a total tech nerd, but you seem to be good at educating. Like, I don't know, maybe like teach other people stuff. And I'd also gotten some good counsel along the way that said, hey, if you go into any sort of people field, you can kind of figure it out. So that's what I ended up doing for my undergrad.
Okay.
Which there was some
Um,
interesting going to a private Christian college with my background. There's some
yeah.
interesting stories in
Yeah,
that
I'm
one.
sure there was. Now you ended up when you were 19, you ended up going through pretty dark time in your life. Talk
Yeah.
about that for a little bit.
Yeah. So, you can't grow up with that kind of childhood trauma and not come out with some scars. I mean, there is
Exactly.
severe damage that happens through all of that. And I think what exacerbated that was, um, the reality that I had to live up to this persona of, everything's great. Everything's wonderful. And I think that's a problem in the church today, even still. People have this
Oh
idea that,
yeah.
you can't really talk about what's really going on and how you're really
Mhm.
struggling and suffering. And my parents are business owners in the community. And so, gosh, they can't have a kid who's struggling with depression and trying to figure out how to navigate life. And that's not something that you can deal with. And then on top of it, being involved in a church, which I'm extremely thankful for, there also was still this level of this is all a fraud.
Mhm.
Everybody's here and they're acting like everything's wonderful, but I know because of their kids that these parents are going through a horrible divorce, and
Right.
like this person's parents is a raging alcoholic, and yet here we show up on Sunday and everybody's saying like, isn't life grand and God is so good and praise the Lord. And then I'm in a Bible college where I know there's a bunch of people going and leading the worship team, but they're also shooting up, in their dorm rooms. And I'm
Mm.
like, that just compounded to a point where it just overtook me. I mean, it just overtook me. And I remember one night in my apartment just being like, this is such a joke. Like, this is such a joke. The duality and duplicity and the hypocrisy of everything. And what is the point? There's just no point to any of this. And I was struggling to figure out because I'm like, I'm technical, but now I'm an elementary teacher. Like, what on earth, if there even is a God, what is even he trying to accomplish in all of that? But at the same time, still trying to pretend like, yeah, I totally believe in this because I signed a statement of faith. And I couldn't
Yeah.
tell anybody what I was going through. And so one night, a bunch of friends are over and we're all hanging out. And I was just like, I'm done. I'm done. And I honestly don't even really remember what happened other than I left my apartment and went on a walk. And then I find myself dangling my feet over the edge of the interstate bridge, counting how long it takes for cars and throwing rocks to see, like, so if I go off at this point, like, how can I make sure I don't miss? And kind of sat there culminating my thoughts, thinking, like, how's this going to happen? And I don't know how to describe what happened other than God just like smacked me in the face with a 2x4
Mm,
and just was like, you're seeing this all wrong. And there's so much more. You just can't see it yet. And I don't, it's not like all of a sudden I woke up and went like, yay, now everything's great. I get it now. But it was enough to make me turn around and walk back to the apartment and just collapse and tell my friends, like, I don't know what's going on, but like I think I just almost ended my own life. And
mm,
I'm so thankful for the friends that I did have at that time because they were the ones who said, we need to get you to a hospital. Like, they didn't shove it under the rug. They didn't say, oh, you're fine. You know, you're a guy. We just all have bad. They took it seriously and they put me in a car and they took me to a hospital and they said, just let's get you through this. And that was really traumatic. Like,
yeah, I
I'm
can
holding it
imagine.
together pretty well, but it was traumatic. It was a
Mhm.
traumatic experience.
How did your life change after that? Like, what did God? How did
Um,
God use that to really change your perspective and change your trajectory and all that?
yeah. You know, I feel like I hear some people, they share their, sanctification journey or what, because there's a moment that I remember in my childhood where I do actually believe, like, I knew that I wanted to put my faith in Christ, or yeah, I didn't
Right.
even really have the theology to understand it. But it was kind of a journey for me. There wasn't this moment where I was saved and then my life just all fit together, which maybe that's just the narrative some people craft and that's not actually how it worked. But so after that, um, I remember I was committed to the psych ward, which, here it's ironic that here my mom, I end up exactly where my mom was, which is
Mhm.
where I swore I never wanted to go, take the same path. But I suddenly had a greater empathy for it. And what was interesting is in that moment, I'm talking to all these people in here and they're telling me their experience and how, like, all they can think about is every possible way they can end their own life and what they can do.
Mm,
And I remember being like, I don't want that. Like, I feel like that, but I don't want that for myself. And like, God, I don't know what you even want for me or if you even have anything for me, but I know I don't want this and I need help. And maybe just the first step is admitting that I need help. And so I think for me, that turned some things in that I had to stop living this dual life of I'm this person here, but I'm then this person here. And then when I'm with this group of people, I'm here. And I think that was actually what started very much a healing process. I got into therapy, started talking through some of the trauma that I'd experienced, processing it, which helped me start to see how God, nowhere near where I am today, but I started to see more how God was using some of this stuff and started to go, well, there is more here. And I don't know what it is, but I'm committed to at least hanging in there and being in for the long haul, whatever that looks like. I don't know what it
right.
looks like, but I guess here's my commitment to that. And so I would say that was where I think my commitment to, like, I'm going to see this through whatever it is, no matter where you take me.
Gotcha. Now, you went on to get your grad degree too, right?
Yeah, that was many years later, because I didn't want to. I don't know why. I just had, again, it was kind of one of those things that I was supposed to do. You got to have a graduate degree. Didn't want to do it and rack up a bunch of debt, and so ended up waiting until I was with an organization where I was able to do it, on their dime.
Mm, that's awesome. What did you end up getting that your grad degree in?
At this point, because this was so much later in my career, I had earlier in my career, I'd kind of hit this fulcrum point where it was like, am I going to commit to the field that I'm in or am I not? because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And ultimately said, you care about bringing out the best in people. So that's probably going to change all over the place. But so I did a second degree in education, but more
Okay.
from a leadership standpoint.
Right.
The degree was a focus on organizational leadership.
Okay. So then, where, like, kind of talk through how you've used that, or kind of what you do now. Like you really focus very heavily on just developing people, right? Is that kind of what
Yeah.
you do in your role now?
Well, that's where all these pieces kind of start to fit together.
Mhm.
Because as I look at just the dysfunction and the trauma of my past, and the more I talked about it openly with people, the more I realized, like, yeah, my experience is probably unique to me, but trauma and dysfunction is not unique to anyone. I mean, everyone has
Absolutely.
experienced some form of trauma and dysfunction that has, and we just know this from the biblical narrative, right? Like sin has
Exactly.
shaped us and it's destroyed us. And so I started to have this greater degree of empathy on, like, I know what it's like to have gone through this and to feel lost and to feel like you don't know what to do and you don't know where you are and to feel like you have nothing to add and what's even the point of being here, and knowing that that's not true, but that you need help in being able to see that's not true, and sometimes you need somebody to help bring that out of you. And so as I look back at, kind of my experience of that, I knew that that's where this was going, but at the same time in a different flair, because my personality, and I also realized we can visit this one if you want. I there was an experience that resulted in the FBI busting into Bible college for an international Beanie Baby fraud. I can share that story.
Yeah, go for it.
But what I realized through that, and I'll share the story, but what I realized through that is I was a gifted leader. Like God had gifted me to lead. And this was a moment in my college years where he's like, are you going to lead for me, or are you going to lead for yourself or for other selfish purposes? And
Mhm.
so that kind of, again, the trajectory of, okay, you've gifted me in these certain things. I can get people to do crazy stuff and they will follow me. And I care deeply about those people, and just kind of building on that, and God going, now, how are you going to use that for my glory and my gain and my kingdom versus your own?
Right. So where did your love for technology start?
Um, I mean, I think it was very, very early on. I always was fascinated by taking apart. Even my biological mom said, even as a kid, it was frustrating to my parents, but they'd find things in the house, electronics, and I would have completely taken them apart, and then I would put them back together, and I would like combine multiple electronics together and be like, hey, look, I made the TV into a this. And they're like, you just broke the TV. Um, and so but what was fascinated to me about it was the fact it was changing what was possible. Like I just always was looking at it going, like, these are things that in the course of human history, we've never been able to do before.
Exactly.
And with that, there's so much potential with this, but yet at the same time, I would look at it and go, but there's so much inherent risk
Yeah.
associated with this. And so to me, that was the fascination with it, was I was looking at this through the duality and going, man, so there is so much we can do to change the world for better. And there's also the possibility we could completely scorch the earth with this. And so
Right.
I think that was the fascination and why I got out of the technical side, because I was like, I'm not interested in the tech piece of it. I'm interested in how this is affecting human capability and human performance and molding that for good versus destruction.
Yeah. And if you really think about how far from a technological standpoint we have come in the last 20 years, it's mind-boggling. I mean, it really is.
Yes.
And so when you think about technology, what are some of the significant trends you see shaping the future going forward?
So, how much time you got? This could
Hey, go for
this
it.
could end up being a 4 day marathon on this. But
4 days.
I think one of the ones that we're continuing to see, I mean, that has been kind of plaguing us for a while. I mean, social media is, again, we're starting to experiment with how humans interact with each other on a
Right.
completely different level than we ever have before. And AI is now tying into that as well. But I think you start looking at all these pieces and you start to see how they fit together. And it's like, we're actually fundamentally changing what it means to be human anymore. And that is exciting. And it's actually extremely concerning. And it's
Mhm.
interesting because I'm going through a class right now on Genesis 1 and talking and just studying kind of the depth of this and idolatry and what it actually looks like. And in many ways, when you think about what idolatry is, it's like God made an image and it's us. And yet we often make other things in what we believe are an image. And the biggest assault to that is it's like, no, he already made his image type of it. And when I see AI and some of the things that are happening, I continue seeing this modern day idolatry where it's like we're looking to technology in some cases for the right reasons. And in some cases, we're almost looking at it as a god.
Right. Yeah. Um, and yeah, we've definitely are in the midst of an AI explosion. I mean, really, since Chat
Yes.
GPT um, was launched, and I mean, it's slowly. I mean, well, not even slowly. It's very quickly just started dominating
Yeah.
so much, and there's so much talk about it. And I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. I mean, I'm kind of like you. There's some exciting aspects of what it can do, but there's also some terrifying aspects of what it can do. I mean, already you're seeing articles on how Chat GPT or just AI, not necessarily Chat GPT, but just AI in general, how many jobs that it can replace um,
Yes.
going forward. I mean, I'm trying to remember some of the ones. Like I know, like everything from like legal assistance,
Yep.
just all kinds of stuff. Just a lot of the careers and stuff that this could easily replace, and that part of it, you know, I don't know. I mean, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Um, so when you look at, and I will say, the bigger category of generative AI as a whole is probably one of the biggest affronts to people's kind of understanding of what AI is capable of and what it can do. And I think that's why we're seeing a whole lot of people going, whoa, 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 whoa. Like I understood the machines were there and they were doing that. I didn't realize we were at this point, which having been close to this for the last 20 years, to me, I'm in a state of, well, I mean, we were running these algorithms 10
Exactly.
years ago. They weren't as mature. So for me, I'm on a different level of the change curve.
Exactly.
And so looking at some of this stuff, but this is part of also why I do so much of my industry work on top of my day job as the chief learning officer. I also do a lot in the industry to educate people on this because yeah, there's definitely scary parts of it. Is it going to replace jobs? Yeah, I don't think there's a single job in the world that's not going to be significantly impacted by it.
Mm,
Whether that's a good or a bad thing though, in many regards depends on how an organization chooses to approach it
that's true.
and what the general population chooses to do about it. Because I mean, that's not new. If you Google jobs that no longer exist, this has been happening for years. There used to be people that were lamplighters, and that was a job, and then
That's
that went
you're
away.
Yeah, you're
So
right.
there's been jobs that have just kind of disappeared because they were no longer relevant. And so I think that's something that we forget. And I think there's some reality of like, well, but do we really understand the work and where is it smart to use AI for these things and where is it not smart? And are we providing people with the right resources to grow and develop into new careers or take their skills and gifts and use them in a different way that is still relevant? Because the other thing that I can say from an industry standpoint, just to qualm fears on this, because there is a lot of fear mongering going on for some very legitimate reasons.
You're
But
right.
one of the other things is the gray tsunami is about to hit things like a ton of bricks. and add which like the boomers are retiring and there's not enough youth to even grow up into organizations. So actually at executive levels, it's a crisis right now. Corporate execs are freaking out
Really?
because even the population rate of people in America, we don't even have enough kids now to repopulate the United States.
Mm,
So population's on a decline, which corporate execs are going, we can't even fill the jobs that we have. And there's not even going to be enough people to come into this. So I think sometimes the concern of will there be enough comes from the scarcity mindset of, well, will there be enough? There's going to be plenty of opportunity, but my concern about it is how are organizations and people going to adapt to it? Because this is where it gets really dangerous on, well, how much are you going to trust an AI to do something that you actually should have a person doing? And it's critical because the way they've been designed, there's something that they need to be able to do that no machine ever can. And a
exactly.
lot of times organizations don't understand the complexity of the work to know where that is. And so that's where I do a ton of work to try and help organizations understand what's actually going on in your organization. What does it mean to augment things with artificial intelligence? Where should you not? And what are you doing with people so that they understand? If anything, the exciting part is if you get AI right, you actually can spend more of your time doing the things that I believe God instinctively designed humans to do. And you can spend more time doing that instead of some of this other stuff that people hate doing in their jobs. But it's like, well, I don't know, I just got to get done. So I just got to take care of it. But
All right.
how we play that equation out is
Yeah,
TBD.
exactly. Well, how do you think the advancements in AI and automation will begin to impact our daily lives in the coming years? I mean, what do you see, like just from a daily life, everyday life standpoint?
Um, One of the things that I think is going to happen very shortly, and we're already starting to see this, is some of the routine things that we often just do because you have to do it, are going to quickly become, assisted by AI. And you're already seeing this, and it's been here for a while. Anybody who's used Grammarly, like you've been writing and you've been getting spell checks and grammar checks
Yeah,
on your stuffs. That's
right.
just going to go to the next level where it's going to make recommendations and it might even write you a first draft of things like that. So I think some of this, there's some real convenience to it. Anybody who's in a job where you're making PowerPoints is probably very excited for the idea that generative AI may be able to like swap together a first draft of a PowerPoint so that you're not doing that. I think we're going to continue to see automation and that continue to impact things, and that is, I think, a risk for people. If you're in a job where you go, I just do XYZ and it's very robotic in nature. Every day I show up and I do this thing and that thing and this thing, and it's very repeatable. I think people are going to start to feel people going, well, do we really need as many people doing that thing? Could we have something automating that? And I think people are going to start to feel that, especially as generative AI starts picking up, because it is capable of doing far more than I think any AI has been able to do in the past.
Yeah. What do you think the role of government should be when it comes to overseeing the development and the use of technology like AI? Should government get involved in that at all? I mean,
So,
I'm to be honest with you
yeah,
personally, I think the least amount of government, the better. That's just my personal opinion. But
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about this. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not a fan personally of heavy government oversight in things in general.
Yeah,
I think it just leads to a lot of bad stuff. You start
I agree.
becoming reliant on the government for too many things. Just read the Old Testament and you see what happens when, you put your faith in some power
Hmm.
that is supposed to take care of things. I think where we've still got to figure this out. Well, add to that, anybody who watched the conversations between Congress and the CEO of TikTok, or Mark Zuckerberg. It's like, I don't know that the technical acumen of the government is where it needs to be to even truly understand what this stuff is.
I
Like, do
completely
you
agree.
even I mean, honestly, there's only a handful of people in my network of tens of thousands of people that I can actually go deep on generative AI and the future of AI, and they even have a clue what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And those aren't the people that I think oftentimes end up being the ones making these decisions. And I think that's a risk. Now, where I
Mhm.
think there is, though, something that does need to be done is, if you look back at all of human history, we don't have a good track record of thinking things through before we just charge
Jump.
forward and say,
Right.
well, we'll figure out what happens later. And there is some real serious risk associated with AI. And if you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you look at, I mean, just so many things in the past where we just went, let's just go. What could possibly go wrong? And then we look back years, decades later and go, whoa, we made
Should
a
have thought that through
giant
a little bit more.
mess. We
Mhm.
maybe should have thought that through a little bit before we just charged forward.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's the government, but somebody needs to at least have something where we are considering the long-term ethical, moral implications of this stuff. I mean, who thought that a like button on Facebook would lead to increase in suicide rate because of,
Exactly.
I mean, just nobody thought about it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh gosh, social media is destroying an entire generation of people. And not that social media is the problem, but nobody thought through, how do we mitigate some of these risks?
So, I mean, so who is the right entity to you know oversee it or really focus on the potential risk and dangers of it? I mean, I agree. I don't really like the idea of the government, but who? I mean,
If I have the answer for it, yeah. Well,
yeah.
but I think this goes back to some of the things that America was founded on, which was like representation from a
Mhm.
diverse group of people who can bring different perspectives and talk this stuff through and say, how do we do that? And in some ways, I think that's what we've lost in the government, is that it's not really representing the people that it's
Right.
supposed to represent. And I
They're
think
representing
that's
their
what we
own
need to figure.
self-interest.
Right. That right. It's become a deity that's just focused on protecting itself and at any cost to others. And it's like, well, that's not really what it was designed to be. So I think whatever it is, it needs to be one of these cross representational groups of people who understand what they're doing, but also have the voices of those who maybe don't understand, but they're going to be impacted, and they understand, like, okay, hey, we can't just say AI is great at all costs, because there is a huge percentage of the population that may be looking at unemployment if we just charge forward with this and don't take the time and effort into actually bringing people along for the ride and helping them show, like, hey, here's what career looks like now.
Right. Uh, and well, let's kind of transition a little bit.
We can
Kind of
start that one,
talking
Matt.
about
Why
this.
don't we do that? We'll just start that group.
Yeah, hey, I'm all for it. um, but let's kind of look at it from a family standpoint, because
Yeah,
a lot of the effects of technology. I mean, you mentioned just a minute ago how the whole like button with teenage depression rates and suicide and stuff like that. So let's kind of take this and turn it around and focus, this whole aspect of technology and everything on the family, and just kind of some of the roles and responsibilities there. And I know you mentioned to me that I know you're married. You have 7 kids. Man,
I do. 7 kids under the age of 12.
I have two, man, and I mean I love them dearly, but I can't imagine having 5 more. So I
Now you
applaud you for
understand
that.
why I'm so excited for spring.
Yeah, because you guys really don't have much choice of getting out. I mean, at least here in North Carolina, even during the middle of winter, I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but yeah, it's a whole different world up there. So let's look at technology from a parent's perspective. We've talked about a lot of different aspects of you know technology and how it's developed and AI and social media and all that. But how can parents maintain a balance between the benefits of technology as well as the potential risks for their children? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
So some of them I
Can I
recognize
can I
come
stop you
easier
real
for
quick
me.
before you answer that?
Yeah.
What are the age
Yeah.
ranges of your kids? Like, what's
Uh
the age ranges there?
12, yeah, so I've got a 12-year-old
Okay,
son, a 12-year-old son. I've got an 8, almost 9-year-old daughter. I've got a 6-year-old son, a 5-year-old daughter, a 3-year-old son, a 1.5-year-old son, and then a
gosh.
newborn.
Mm. All right, yeah. So just pick up from there. Like, what can parents? How can parents maintain a balance between the
Yeah.
benefits and the potential risk?
Well, and that's the line I won't pretend that I've perfected, but that I'm
Mhm.
trying to walk
Right.
very intentionally. And again, I recognize for me it's probably a little easier because I'm super familiar with the technology.
Hmm.
So I'm immersed in it. I understand what it is. I understand the good and the risks associated with it. And I think that as a parent, that's a really important thing to take the time to do. And I'm not suggesting anybody get as nerdy as I am when it comes to this stuff. I think that might be overkill for folks. But staying connected to people who do understand this and understanding not just the risks, because I think sometimes as parents that's where it's easy to go, is to go to one end of the extreme of either, oh, it's fine, everybody's doing it, there's nothing they can get into trouble with, and it's like, oh no, they can get into trouble 1,000 times faster and easier than I ever could as a kid.
Yeah.
And then the counter response is like freak out, like I'm never going to give my kid a device and they're never going to have anything to do with tech. And it's like, well, you're setting them up for failure when they go into a world that's fully immersed in it. And some of the way that you do that is actually knowing about it yourself. And the other thing I like to do with my kids is I invite them into those conversations and talk openly with them. I think, and this is a sensitivity I have to how I grew up. I grew up in a very, I'm the parent, you're the kid.
Yeah.
There's no, you have no value to add. I have the expertise, you don't. And I really have tried to say, you have expertise. It's a different lens, it's a different angle. I have some more wisdom because I've been around the block more, but your voice matters. And so inviting them into that and actually listening and understanding what is it, why is this important to you? Like, let's talk about these things. Why, my kids like to play Minecraft. What is it
Hmm.
about Minecraft? Like, let's actually explore this because we were hesitant about turning multiplayer on for a bit for some of the older ones. And we're like, oh, I don't know. And then we started talking about it and talking with them and saying, how can we work with you to make sure that you don't get into trouble with this? And instead of telling them, asking them, let's brainstorm, let's work together on this. How can we have open, transparent policies on how we use technology? And let's just have open dialogue and let's talk regularly about that and inviting them into relationship on that where they know I care and I'm doing this not to be a parent and domineering, but because I genuinely want you to be successful and comfortable with the tech. But I also want to protect you, and it's my job to protect you. And I can't do that well if I don't understand what you're doing. And being a loner as a kid, I mean, half the time I got into so much trouble was because nobody cared enough to pay attention to what I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to sum up what you're saying, it's all about communication. I think that's
It
so
is.
important, and I think so many parents just shove their kids off into a corner and hand them these devices, and just so that they can. For a lot of people, it's just that they can get a break for a little bit, but they're shoving them off into a corner with these devices, and they're not having these conversations about a lot of what their kids are seeing, what they're engaging in. Um, and so I couldn't agree more. It's got to start with healthy communication and just really encouraging them to talk.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I
absolutely.
think, two other things I would add to that is one, knowing the tech helps because there are certain boundaries that I just have, where I'm like, you're not going to be on social media.
Mm,
I know the effects of it. I
exactly.
know what it's capable of. I know you're mentally. not and emotionally not at a state to be able to process that well, there are ways that we talk about, but it's important for me to stay connected with certain people. Okay, that's fine. Like, let's address that problem to make sure we figure out how can we use technology to manage that and manage that well. But I'm not just going to give you the keys to the car and say, I'm sure it'll be fine. Go surf TikTok and no big deal. It's like certain apps, they're off limits. It's just off
Yeah.
limits. You're not allowed to
Right.
do it. But I also follow pretty strict guidelines for myself too, because I don't want my kids to go, well, daddy says this for us,
But then he
but he
does the
lives a
opposite.
totally duplicative life.
Right.
Like, he's over here doing all this other stuff. It's like, no, I've got, you know, Guardian software, and I make sure that I have a policy with my wife that she wants to see what's on my phone or any of my devices. Like, you go ahead, like, you have full transparency into this. We're going to we're going to do this together. And I think even for my older son, he's 12 now, he's getting to that age where, I mean, I remember being 12, and again, being open in conversation about some of this stuff has been really helpful. But I think the other thing that has been extremely helpful in navigating this is every night I spend probably 2 to 3 hours with my kids just in relationship. And a big part of that time is in conversation and prayer, and also reading through and studying the Bible together. And
Yeah.
not in like an annoying, like, okay, daddy's going to read from the scriptures, type of. It's like I've found some cool shows that we can watch that help illustrate it. And then we read through the text and just talk about it. Not in a, I have all the knowledge and I'm going to now tell you how it is, but talking about, like, well, what do we see here? Like, how do these things fall apart? Like, what happened with David and Bathsheba? Like, wow, look
Yeah.
at that. Like, notice how that happened. Where do we see that kind of stuff happening today? And some people will be like, you talk with your kids about that? But it's like, obviously you do it through a lens that's child appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I am continually amazed by how wise and sharp they are at picking up on things and picking up on patterns and seeing this stuff and asking questions. And I think that helps tremendously, because when you ground them in truth, you can see a counterfeit so much easier if you've spent your time knowing what the real thing is. And I
Right.
know, folks, the analogy, I don't remember. I had a friend who was in, I don't remember, it was in like currency or something. And he's like, we spend so much time studying like a real dollar bill, so much so that when we pick up a fake, like, I don't even need to run any test. I just know instinctively when something's wrong. And I've just seen that in my own kids, that the more time we spend in, well, what really is the truth? Like, let's study the truth and talk about it openly. Man, they pick up on the counterfeit. Honestly, sometimes faster than I do. Where I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, you guys caught that quick. And they're like, yeah. And so we're thinking about this. And so would this be an area of opportunity that we would want to be careful with, type of a thing? And like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. So, at what point do you start introducing your kids to technology, and what do you start them with? Like, how does that introduction kind of happen in your house?
So I guess it depends on what you consider technology,
Right. I
right?
mean,
Like, I
there's
feel like
definitely
our
different.
TVs are
Exactly.
right, like our TVs are smarter than
Yeah.
the computer that landed the shuttle on the
On
moon,
the moon.
type of a thing.
Right.
So in that sense, you know, like, we're not one of those families that's like no devices, no
Hmm.
screen time. I'm
Yeah.
like, I get it. Like, sometimes, good grief, with 7 kids, like, you guys, just, can you watch a show for a little bit so that
Yeah.
I can
Right.
have a breather?
Breather.
But
Yeah.
like, none of our kids, we don't let them have the remote. Like, that's one of the things that it's like, you don't, we have the watch history on and you don't get the remote, because, and we learned that the hard way, because when our son was, I think, 9, um, we walked in and he was, you know, surfing through Netflix, looking at stuff, and we're like,
Mm.
"Oh my gosh!" Like, we just
Yeah.
didn't even think about it. And so, instead of freaking out, we had a conversation about it, and we talked through, what's going on and this and that, and then we said, like, I think it's just, and it was his suggestion. I don't think I should have the remote. Like, I think that's a good suggestion, buddy. Like, I think maybe it's best if mommy and daddy are involved with that.
That's
So I
pretty
think even
awesome that
things as
he
simple as the TV.
yeah, I mean, that's pretty awesome that he, was able to come to that conclusion on his own. I mean, says a lot.
It was a proud father moment for me. I
Mhm.
mean, I was really proud of my son for doing that because, and again, he had kind of put the pieces together and we'd been talking about, just more generically temptation and this and that. And he was the one who saw, like, when I have this control, it's really hard for me to control it. And so
Yeah.
maybe if I don't have it, and it worked out great because instead of me going, "You're never watching TV again for the rest of
Mhm.
your life," type of a thing, it was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, then we can talk about the shows that you want to watch." And same thing with that. The kids all know if there's a show they want to watch or they've heard about, they have to talk to us about it. And it's not
Yeah.
a, draconian we choose or vote up or down. It's like, well, let's have a conversation. What about that show is interesting to you? What's in the
Yeah.
show? Why do you really enjoy it? Type of a thing, and bring them in. Our kids, they've got iPads. I'm not interested in giving them devices where they can, be mobile wherever they are. So they've got
Mhm.
iPads, but it's controlled and the Wi-Fi turns on and off at a certain hour and they've got the time limit set up and different apps and things like that. But I'm like, you need to understand how to do that. And I actually spend a lot of time with them on stuff. I
Yeah.
taught them iMovie and we worked together on like how can you be a creator? They were fascinated by all the content I create. Like, great, I'll show you how to use some of these apps and
Yeah.
tools. And you can use it for your own thing, but it's under the governance of us and it's in relationship. It's not daddy makes the rules and I tell you what they are. I invite you into that dialogue and we talk about what are the things. And so it really is kind of constantly changing. And I would also say it's different for each of the kids.
Yeah.
Different kids have different governance
Needs
and
and
rules and
exactly.
responsibilities based on where they are. There's no universal rule for us that is just like, and at this age, you get an iPad. Like,
Right.
no,
Yeah.
it's when we work to decide when it's appropriate.
Yeah. So how can parents, just give some advice? How can parents stay informed about a lot of the latest trends and potential dangers in technology for their children? How can they stay up to date on that stuff?
Yeah. Um, so I think you have to be careful with this in that we're in the information overload age
Yeah.
where you can find you can find information on just about anything if you're looking for it. And that's a good thing, but it's also a terrifying thing in that you can freak yourself out really, really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And that to me is bad because that's where you go to the one extreme. You either just ignore it because it's too much or you go into it. Personally, my two recommendations are one, I'm a big podcast person. There are some really good podcasts. They are slipping my mind right now. Otherwise, I would rattle them off that I think do a good job of just helping break this stuff down. Um, I've debated starting a podcast kind of talking about this because I do it for professionals. I talk about the
Yeah.
implications of my podcast Learning Tech Talks is like how does this affect you in the professional world? I've considered doing something similar on the like personal side. How do you think about this? But I think sometimes those things can be helpful. But going back to some of the other things that we've talked about here, to me, it's relational because you can hear things on these big trends and all this other stuff. And it's like, right, but like, what is your environment? And I think in some ways that's one of the damages we're seeing as a result of the internet is we've started making decisions and thinking about things based on like global implications of stuff when it's like, right, but what's happening in your neighborhood, in your backyard? And who are the people you can talk to in that level of proximity that can speak to some of this stuff instead of reading, this big name stuff that might have you making decisions that's on a scale that just is not even in your ballpark.
You mentioned that you don't allow social media like TikTok and things like that for your kids, at least at this point. Is there a certain age that you and your wife have discussed, I mean, is it going to be off limits until they're adults, or like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, we definitely do see, there's a lot of research that's come out on the effects that social media and just that like button itself has on the mental health of teenagers. And so, I mean,
Yeah.
kind of share your thoughts on that.
So I'm sensitive to the fact that I guarantee that if there are parents that listen to this, right, there's times where you look at it and go, oh, if I could go back, I would do it differently.
Yeah.
And my kids aren't at a teenage age yet. So for
Yeah.
me, the pressure, mom, dad, like, why can't I have this and that? It's not there yet. Um, but I don't know that I will be comfortable with them being on social media unless it's one where there's some real governance around how it's used. And I don't know that social media was necessarily designed that way. Now, my wife and
Yeah.
I have started looking into software like Covenant Eyes and things like
Mhm.
that may give us a little more oversight. And again, not to be draconian, but more so that we can invite them into conversation. So I don't know. Because again, to me, one of the things that I've studied on this is their brains just are not at a level where they can comprehend some of the stuff.
Yeah.
So even if you governed what they looked at and what they did, like we said, the social dynamics of it shaping their identity of, well, people aren't liking my stuff and people are, that really affects kids. And so even if you said, well, you can have it, but you can only be connected with your friends, it's like, well, but you can't ever completely trim down an app to only do that. And even in that sense, so that's where, again, I'm trying to stay as current as I can with all of the apps and things like that. And even though I don't use many of them myself, I try and stay familiar to kind of say, where can we do this? Like, I love the app Marco Polo because I'm like,
I've heard of
hey,
that.
if you have people you want to talk with and you want to see them, let's keep it relational, but like it's confined to a limit of you can only have people that you have as contacts, and we have things set up where you can't add contacts without talking to us about it. So we're just kind of continually exploring that. I won't pretend I have all the answers, and I think that's where for me
Yeah.
it's about keeping a really tight relationship with my kids and
Yeah.
hearing them out, and then working together with them and saying, well, like, let's come up with a plan that works for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I said a minute ago, it all goes back to communication.
It
Well,
does.
do you have any advice on the parent who has allowed their teenager up to this point to partake in,
Run wild.
yeah, and they've noticed the consequences and the results, and they're trying to figure out how to pull it back? I mean,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts?
So, yeah. So I say this from my own sensitivity to how I grew up and what I think I've always longed for, that I'm trying to create with my kids is the best place to start is to, where is your relationship at with your kids? Because I think one
Mm,
of the worst things you can do as a parent, just even from my experience in their youth, is when you just like react to things and it seems like you're just swooping in to take over, you're going to have a visceral reaction to it. And
yeah,
the reality is, this technology is everywhere. So
yeah,
the idea that you can somehow police your way out of it, it's not going to work. And if anything, you're going to drive it into the shadows, which is the absolute last place
worst
you
thing.
want that to happen.
Yeah,
And so I think if you are a parent that it's run wild or you're starting to see this stuff happening in your kids, I think the first question you almost have to ask yourself is, do I have a strong relationship, and not just I'm around them or we talk, but do I actually have a strong relationship with my child in other areas before I just march in on this one because I'm coming in going, I'm seeing problems with this and we need to do something about it. Because that's going to push them further away versus if you do the hard work to go, you know what, maybe my relationship isn't as strong as it needs to be. Maybe the place you start isn't, oh, I just need to dominate your social media or do this other stuff because I'm concerned about this. I get that may be the initial reaction, but I think if you can start building that relationship in other areas, it's going to open the door for conversations to start talking about these things and opening the door for talking about the changes you may be seeing in your kid. I've noticed this about you, and let them talk about it. Like, what's going on with that? Is there something I suspect that this may be affecting that? Is that true? Because maybe it's not. Maybe it has nothing to do with it. Maybe it has to do with the friends they hang out with, or gosh, just being a teenager is hard
Yeah.
in and of itself.
Yeah.
And until you really understand who they are and what they deal with, and they believe you care and you not only love them, but you like them, you're not going to have the opportunity to actually mold it and shape it in a positive way.
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff, man. Again, and I'll say it again because I don't think it can be said enough, and I think it's an area where so many parents they fail at. It's all about communication. It's all about really just having the conversations with your kid and maintaining that relationship. And so, yeah, man, couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
As I
Well, and
mentioned
what's
that,
funny about that
yeah, go
is,
ahead.
one thing I was just going to add to that, that's interesting. Just sharing a little bit of kind of my story on this is, I think the relational piece for me has amped up more in recent years than I think I even originally understood. Because for me, the idea of like this relationship with your parent versus, well, parent child type of a thing in a healthy way, not like we're best friends, type of a thing, but like a healthy relational thing, that was relatively newer for me. And
Mhm.
even in my own journey, like I have a bunch of kids, but when I first became a parent, I honestly, when I got married, didn't want kids. I saw them as a barrier and an intrusion onto what I needed to accomplish and all this stuff. And I wrestled with that for a long time as a parent. I loved my kids, but I was like, yeah, but kind of like in my way type of
Yeah,
a thing. And this is another one of those moments where God whacked me over the head with a 2x4 and was like, this is your mission. Like, this is what I want you doing. Like, this is how I've gifted you. This is where I want you to have an impact. And it was like, I woke up to it and suddenly had a different perspective. And so suddenly the things that were like, oh, well, fine, I'll make time for this because I love you. And suddenly it was like, no, this is an opportunity for me to influence the next generation. And so I think as parents, that mindset shift, I get it. Kids are hard.
yeah,
They're exhausting. They're
yeah,
tiring, all this stuff. But I think when you flip that mindset, all of a sudden it's like, no, a relationship with your kids, it's not just something you do because you have to, because they're your kids. It's like, no, this is something that God called you into. And that's why He gave you the kids in the first place. So lean into that.
and here you are 7 kids later.
Well, it was so funny with it. We shouldn't have 7 kids. Like, this is the funny part.
Wow.
I don't need to share all the details, but statistically, we should not have 7 kids.
Mm.
And every single time, and this is where, again, for the first like 4 or 5, I was like, what are you doing, God? Like, what are you doing? Like, why do you keep bringing these things into my life? And then it was like 6, and then my mindset changed. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this actually is how you've blessed me in this, and I have not even seen it for what it was. Like, I
Yeah,
really hadn't. But and yeah, so now people ask me, they're like, so are you done? I'm like, I'm not answering that question, because the second I do, that's when I find out we're expecting another one, despite the fact we shouldn't be. So I'm
yeah,
like, I don't know, seven's a complete number, so maybe I'll just lean on that. But I'm like, I
yeah.
have no idea.
That's awesome. Well, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, you also wrote a book called Relentless Intention: The Power of
Yeah.
Purpose. Talk a little bit about your book, if you will, starting with, really what led you to write it.
So I had said I didn't ever want to write a book. I'd done my undergrad, I'd done grad school. I had built kind of a, reputation in the industry and a career. And so the thought of writing a book just to me seemed like a cliche, something, oh, people do, you reach a point in your career and you go write a book type of a thing. And I didn't really want to do that. And quite frankly, I didn't really feel I had an important story to tell. Like, I don't really have that important of a story to tell. I like, sharing insights and connecting with people, but a book, it just felt overwhelming. Um, and then don't remember why, and I'd even told my wife this because she was the first one that was like, "Now you want to write a book?" I woke up in the middle of the night once and was like, "Oh my gosh, I have to write a book." And it's a collection of these stories of how when nothing made sense and I felt like, what am I even doing here? And I can't see the path ahead of me. How did I find it? And how did I see it was there all along?
Mm,
You didn't define something that wasn't already in place. You didn't discover something that wasn't there. You just discovered what God had planned for you. And it's not a Christian book by any means, but it's written by a Christian
right.
in an attempt to try and help people who are struggling with this and help them see you do matter. Like you are beautifully and wonderfully made. And despite what you may see or think or the situation you're in, there's purpose behind that. And when you can figure that out, it can change your trajectory fundamentally.
Yeah. So if people want to get their hands on it, how can they get it?
Well, they may have to wait for a bit
Okay.
because I went like I wrote it and I got a coach to help me, gather my thoughts with things. And so it's all done. I've sent out some early drafts to people
Okay.
and I didn't realize how hard it is to publish a book. I thought the
Yeah.
writing part, so for anybody listening who's like, maybe I'll write a book, writing the book, that's
Is
an
the easy
effort in
part.
and of itself. And then you're like, oh gosh, like I've got to do something with this now. And I mean, I could have just, done some self thing and just published it, but I'm like, well, no, if I do it, I want to go through the right process and make sure I'm doing it. So I've got it. I've got the title. I've got everything. I'm trying to finalize some of the designs on the covers. So it's basically done. It's just a matter of when I'm going to finalize with the publisher and actually get it out. So my guess is I've set a target to say it better be done this year. It was originally scheduled to launch in March, and then it got delayed a little bit. So it's probably not going to be too far out.
Yeah. When it gets done, I'd love to get a copy of it and then have you back on and we can actually talk specifically about the book. That'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, no, you can read it and then you can learn more about what that Beanie Baby story was.
Right. So what's coming up for you? Anything exciting on the horizon? I mean, I know you talked about the book. Is there anything you're currently involved in that you haven't mentioned already that you'd like to talk about?
Um, well, I feel like I'm always doing exciting stuff. So nothing. Well, the newest thing, like I said, I do a lot of industry work. So I do a lot of speaking publicly. Have been trying to get more involved in the Christian community around this, which is an interesting space to break into. Not necessarily to try and become some sort of leader in the Christian space, but I know the gifts that I've built that have helped organizations and individuals. Like, I think the church needs some of this. Like, they're
Yeah,
struggling to navigate how do we navagate technology and how do we figure out how to disciple in the digital age and
very
how do
true.
we parent kids and so I've tried to lean into this and try and say, hey, like I do want to help with this and I've been around the block. But like I said, I continue to look for ways to get involved with the Christian circle to help them navigate this. And then in preparation for the book, I want to have a podcast that goes along with the book that really tells the stories of people who, right, they're not all the superhero stories you see on social media, the
Yeah,
superheroes that have accomplished everything, but the people who they've found purpose and they've done unusual and extraordinary things in confusingly ordinary ways, and discovered that what they needed was right in front of them the whole time.
yeah, absolutely. Well,
And no
Christopher, I
kids
guess
on the
we
horizon to my awareness. So
to
that's
your awareness.
to my awareness. My youngest is only 3 months old or 4 months
Right,
old. So
right.
hopefully.
Well, man, I guess we should start wrapping up the conversation. But I've very much enjoyed our time together today, and I definitely appreciate you being on the podcast. Where can people find you if they are interested in connecting with you? Maybe they want some just some tips on any
Sure.
of the stuff you talked about
Yeah,
today.
so I'm a very collaborative person, and despite the fact I'm extremely introverted, I connect with a lot of different people because, right, just trying to help. So, in terms of connecting with people, if you're on social media, my social is LinkedIn. So, I use LinkedIn a lot. If people are on LinkedIn, if you connect with me on there or follow me on there, you can see all my stuff. I'm continuing to build out some stuff on YouTube to try and do that. But people a lot of times just email me from my website, Learning Sharks. And even though it's like, well, but that's like a professional company website, it's like, yeah, but I'm on the other end of it and it's just
Yeah.
me. So a lot of people end up just going to my website and reaching out and saying, hey, heard this or saw this, just wanted to touch base with you and find out more. And it always ends up coming right to me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being on the podcast, Christopher. Anything else you want to share before we
Yeah,
go?
I appreciate you having me. No, I mean, this has been a fun conversation. And
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, no, I mean, I think only closing thoughts is I am very sensitive to how hard things can be right now and how scary it can be, whether it's technology, whether it's the economy, whether it's uh, parenting. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things going on. And yeah, no, I think it's just hopefully I can continue helping people navigate and learning from others along the way. So, no,
Yeah,
nothing else.
absolutely. Thanks, man. Appreciate you. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my time with Christopher Lind. Just a quick reminder that if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you're listening on. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and review. And if you're listening on Spotify, hit the follow button and the bell icon to be notified when new episodes are released. Also, if you're enjoying the content here on the Warrior Podcast, please consider donating to help keep this content coming. Links to do so will be in the show notes. Take care, guys, and see you next time on the Warrior Podcast.